Morning, Mr. Mays. How are you, sir?
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can. Yeah.
Sweet. Got you on a loudspeaker here. Sounds pretty good.
Cool.
I need to get a camera so you can see the class.
That would be
Here's-
cool.
Here. Thanks for
Do, 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 do. Ooh, hey, better microphone. Much better microphone.
Been heck of a week for sure.
Yeah.
What's the 3 Let's see. Oh, yeah, this one. Yeah.
My audio is still good over there, guys. I just switched microphones out, so.
Booming. Yep, booming indeed.
Sweet.
I'll take on with, yeah, I see coupons for Christmas gamers. I'm gonna move you here temporarily so you can see everyone.
Great. I love that. I swear I need more screens for doing this than I do when I'm actually doing dev work, trying to keep see the Slack thread and see the class and hey, everybody. Good morning. Lovely to be with you all virtually on this Saturday.
So feeling okay, Eric?
Yeah. Luckily, so far so good. My wife is absolutely miserable right now. But I am thankfully not yet. So the one and only time COVID actually came through our house previously, she brought it home from a conference and gave it to me on my birthday. It was amazing. I had a long 4-day weekend for my birthday and I got COVID on that Friday, got sick, and I was like, I'm so mad at you right now.
You have to do some solid work.
Just get one more thing arranged here for myself, so I try to keep myself straight. Day 2. All right. I'll go ahead and get some screen sharing started here. I know we got a couple minutes still. Share that guy. Okay. Get rid of that thing here. Oh, let's see if I can see more people. All right.
One thing I haven't been able to, I've tried to fix it, but this Zoom account for some reason requires you to admit everybody. So if
Oh, I
I'm
saw
ever,
on this meeting, the waiting room option was checked. Do you not want that on?
no,
Yeah, if we turn that off, I think it'll stop doing that.
okay. But yeah, until we turn that off, just make sure to, if I'm not on the Zoom for some reason, make sure to pay attention to that and admit
Yeah,
people.
you got it. I am not logged in the right way to edit that meeting right now, but it looks like waiting room is turned on. So if we turn that off, that should fix that. I'm trying to figure out where I see the waiting room. I think because you're the host, I don't see it.
Are you logged in with the,
I did, but I would have had to take host from you to become host. Oh, wait, hang on. I got to manage participants window. I got it, I think.
Yeah.
Which is weird. Yeah, I'm not sure how this is going to work. Like, yeah, because you're hosting and then I'm also me, and we're both okay coders. Good time.
okay, maybe I'll just, yeah.
I don't see the waiting room though. Is there anybody in there that we're waiting on?
Not at the moment, but I'm checking on Tulsa. There they are.
Hey, Tulsa.
Here they are. There we are.
We're here.
Hi.
I'm so sorry I'm not in the room with you today. I will be next week, I promise. Unless
Okay.
somebody tries to
Rather
give me
not be
another,
sick.
disease. So. Yeah, I feel fine, but she tested positive yesterday, and I was like, I'm not going to be the one that gets the whole Tulsa cohort sick for one day of JavaScript. Not worth it yet.
Appreciate
We're
it.
in a really hard topic, then I don't know, maybe or whatever. I certainly don't want to endanger anybody. So awesome. Well, good morning, everybody. Hopefully everybody can see my VS Code up on the screen now, and let's get into some stuff. Got lots of fun stuff today. I wanted to start by just kind of making sure we don't leave anybody behind. I am definitely in a no developer left behind mentality. I hate no child left behind, but anyway. So I want to start with just leaving some space. Does anybody have any really like burning or pressing questions about either the dragon slaying exercise or last class stuff that you just are feeling amazingly stuck on right now? You can either, I've got the cohort Slack channel open if it's easier to throw them in there, or you can just, speak up if there's anything you'd like me to take a quick pass at reviewing or answering about stuff you've done so far. I'm going to take that resounding silence as you all know JavaScript now. So our work here is done. Let's all go for donuts.
It's probably shyness more than anything, but yeah.
No. We're good. We're good. So don't worry. I will, at any point, again, please feel free to shout out questions. And also, I just want to point out some things I noticed from last class and kind of just reviewing the Zoom interaction bit. I am not a Zoom expert, and it is sometimes hard right now I have 5 windows open on 3 screens to try to keep track of everything I'm showing you and doing. And it is not always the easiest for me to figure out who exactly, especially in this group setup, is asking a question or to necessarily catch them all if 2 of you talk at the same time. So that's just part of the nature of Zoom. It is what it is. If at any point, though, you feel like you asked a question and I've missed it, please either speak up again or DM me or put it in the Slack channel. I want to make sure that everybody's questions are getting addressed and I'm not dropping anybody just because I'm missing it in the nature of the Zoom interaction. So awesome. All right. We talked real briefly at the very end as people were leaving yesterday about some VS Code extensions, and I'm actually showing you a couple of them right now. If you didn't see the message in the cohort channel, I created a little recommendation JSON you can throw in your workspace that'll make it easy to install, a few that'll make your JavaScript life easier. Feel free to share others you like. It's easy to get like overloaded on extensions and then have them fight with each other. So I try to keep it simple. We recommended Prettier for you all, which will just kind of auto format stuff. You can have it do it on save or on command as you see fit. That's one of them that's in there. I don't personally use Prettier because I don't like it, but I think it's a great tool for you all to save you some formatting time right now. If anybody wants to know, I don't like it, we can talk about that outside of class. There is ESLint, which will just do some static linting. So if you're not familiar with the idea of linting, that's just essentially static code analysis, which means it's not going to run your code. It's just going to look at how all your code is written, what functions get called, what variables are defined, and how things reference each other, and look for places you may have made mistakes, and where you've written some invalid JavaScript. So that's what ESLint is there to help with. Then I recommended Indent Rainbow, which I am a huge fan of. We'll see that here in, for example, our DOM example we'll look at here in a second, or in this one, and it gives you this nice little color-coded shading of your indent levels, which makes it way easier to see how stuff is nested. And the deeper we get into objects, the more useful that's going to become for you. And then better comments is another personal favorite of mine. And so I kind of have used that here already. So better comments is really simple. All it does is if you put a question mark in the front of your comment, it'll turn it blue. If you put to do at the front of your comment, it turns it orange. If you put an exclamation point, it turns it red. If you put an asterisk, it turns it a lighter green. So you have the ability to kind of like color code your thinking about your code without doing any extra work for free. So I kind of love that. So that's what's in there. Cool. Then I think we're going to say I'm done with that and kill that item. Okay, I have a to-do. Let's talk about types a little bit more. I felt like I blew through that really quickly last class, and we're going to get more deeply into strings and arrays today. So I wanted to just take a second and make sure we didn't get the cart out in front of the horse, and that we felt okay, at least about the core JavaScript types. So in JavaScript, there are 8 core types, 7 primitives, and object. Okay, that's the way I think about it anyway. So what do we mean when we talk about something being a primitive? We mean, I've got a nice little definition for you here. It is not an object. So I said there's 8 types, 7 primitives, and an object. So it's all the ones that aren't an object. It also has no methods or properties. That's going to seem real weird in a second because we're about to do string methods and array methods and all that sort of fun stuff. So strings and arrays totally have methods, but their primitive types do not. So the actual value when you store a string somewhere has no properties, has no methods. It's just a value. Okay. So that's the definition of a primitive. Everything else in JavaScript that isn't a primitive is an object. That's just kind of the way JS sort of works as far as types go. And so we're going to talk about objects kind of separately. And even today, we're just going to barely touch them because we're going to do a whole nother class on getting deep into the weeds of objects. Okay. So let's talk about the primitives real quick. So string we've already looked at a little bit. We're going to get deeper into that today, right? String is just a representation of text for us, typically encoded in UTF-8, and it is, you know, characters, numbers. We can define strings in a few ways, right? And we'll dig into those a little deeper. But, you know, single quotes, double quotes, backticks, we'll kind of talk through all of that in a little bit here. But that's strings, okay? We have numbers, which we played a little bit with last class, and the difference between like the plus operator, if we've got numbers versus strings, right? Numbers in JavaScript are kind of overly simplified in a way that makes them complicated compared to other programming languages, or simple, depending on how you want to think about it. So in a lot of programming languages, you have, if we think about 2 different types of numbers, typically integers and floats, right? And so if you're not familiar with those terms from a math background or anything, an integer is a whole number in this case, and a float is going to have some decimal component, right? So it's a fraction. It has something after a decimal. In a lot of languages, those are defined as ints and floats. In JavaScript, they're all just numbers. So you don't have to worry about that. You can do let x equal 3 or let x equal 3.2, and they're both numbers to JavaScript. It's fine with it. The reason that sort of works, without getting too deep into the technical weeds, under the hood, every number in JavaScript is a 64-bit float. So if you've ever touched another programming language, that's often called a double precision float. But that's it. JavaScript just treats everything as a 64-bit float. And then when you try to use it like an integer or whatever, it just kind of tries to make that nice for you. Don't worry too much about that. Just bring it up because occasionally, and maybe we'll demo some of it today if we have time, you'll get into some real weirdness when you do math in JavaScript and expect things to give you answers they don't quite. Because inherently floating point math is inaccurate, right? if we have a number that has an infinite number of decimals, like pi, for instance, we aren't going to represent all of the decimals. We're going to pick the first 5, 10, 15 decimal places, whatever it is, right? And so we've already made a decision on how to round or truncate that number. If we add that to another number we've rounded or truncated, we're going to start to introduce rounding errors over time. And so 3 + 1 will not always be 4 in JavaScript. Sometimes it might be 4.000000000000132 or something, right? Depending on how many operations we did to get to that math. So just know that that's a thing that as you get further into your JavaScript journey, you will sometimes occasionally have to handle math weirdness in JavaScript because everything's afloat. But for now, numbers are numbers. Just don't think about it too much. We have another special number type we're not really going to touch today in any real depth, but it's BigInt. And that's a fairly newer primitive. And the whole point it's there is to represent exactly what it sounds like. Integers that are too big to fit in a number. So I mentioned numbers are all 64-bit floats. So the largest number I can represent as an integer is 64 ones. I'm out of space to represent the number anymore. If I need a number that's bigger than whatever 64 ones is in binary, I need something else. Or we'll run into a common problem in programming known as integer overflow, which causes lots of really weird things to happen. Anybody see the relatively semi-recent videos of people breaking Tetris, where they crashed the last level and broke the game? It's fun. It's an integer overflow error. So essentially, like, they beat so many levels at so many lines that their score and level are supposed to tick over, but the NES can't store a number big enough to give them the next level, so it crashes the game. So you can break Tetris and beat it in theory. It does not go on forever because you run out of room in that integer. And the NES uses smaller integers than 64 bits, so it has smaller numbers that's limited to also. It's an 8-bit system. So just be aware of that. So for instance, if I have the largest possible integer I can make in JavaScript and I add 1 to it, a couple of things could happen. It could throw an error because it's figured out that I've made a number it can't hold, or it could just roll back around to 0 because it doesn't know what to do with the extra bit I just added. And that gets really weird when you have the biggest number you can imagine and you add 1 to it and you get 0. You definitely don't expect that. So just be aware, integers have a size. Numbers have a size. We can only make them so big. BigInt gives us a way to deal with numbers that are bigger than that. The other way we often deal with numbers that are too big to fit in a number is to treat them like strings, because we can write 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 as characters for as long as we want. We can make a string that is essentially infinitely long, and then deal with treating those characters in the string as numbers to do math on them in chunks. And that gets a lot more complicated. So BigInt simplifies a fair amount of that if you ever have to deal with really, really large numbers. I suspect for most of what we're ever going to do in this module, at least for sure, I would be kind of surprised if you all ever needed a BigInt or ran into a number so large that you were exceeding what fits in a 64-bit float. Any questions about numbers or strings in the broad sense before we move on? We're going to, again, go deeper into strings and numbers today, but. Okay. Booleans. Anybody want to tell me what a Boolean is? It's an easy one.
True, false.
True, false. That's it. So it has 2 possible states. Boolean is either true or false. That's all Boolean means. I'm going to skip over undefined for a second because I'm going to talk about it together with null here in a minute. So I'm just going to briefly mention symbol. Symbol is a type that until you get into more advanced stuff, you probably won't use directly, but you may be using it without realizing it sometimes. A symbol in JavaScript is simply a value that is guaranteed to be unique. So every time you instantiate a new symbol, you will get a value that doesn't exist anywhere else in the code. It will not conflict with any other symbols. That primarily becomes useful when you're doing things like putting stuff in an object and you want to just dynamically insert stuff into the object, and you need to make sure your property name doesn't collide with any other property names that are already in the object. You can use symbols for those things. But that's a little more nuanced and advanced, so don't worry about that too much. Symbols are just a unique value. That's it. It's an identifier. I need to identify something with some unique name, quote unquote, or symbol. Okay, let's talk a little bit about undefined and null. They're very similar, but not the same. Okay. So I'm going to jump down here to this line, highlight it, because that's going to point this out. So on the left, I have font ligature, so it's a little hard to see. That's 3 equals between null and undefined on the left and 2 on the right. So we're going to get more into that with Boolean logic in another class coming up here. But there are two ways to compare two values in JavaScript: strict and loose equality. Okay, so if you use two equal signs, you're saying this is loose equality. And if you use three, it's strict equality. Anybody know what the difference is between the two or have a guess? Oh, cool. Okay, so in loose equality, remember we talked about duck typing? So anybody want to remind me what duck typing is in JavaScript?
Hey, Eric, will you zoom in just one?
Oh, yeah,
Extra.
totally. You got it. Better?
Yeah.
We're gonna close that out too. Give some more room. Okay, so I was highlighting, I moved my cursor, this guy here. Null strictly equals not equal to defined, undefined, but null is loosely equal to undefined. So remember, if it walks like a duck, talks like a duck, quacks like a duck, it's a duck. So when we talk about loose equality or two equal signs, we are talking about, is it close enough to a duck that I can consider it equal? So in this case, here, I'll just open a new line and give you an example. 2 as a string is loosely equal to 2 as a number. That is true. However, 2 as a string is not strictly equal to 2 as a number. Okay. Does anybody have a hunch as to why that is now, what we're actually looking at here? What strict equality might mean?
Comparing types.
Yep. So if it's loose equality, even if we have to coerce one of the types, that's called type coercion. So I'm going to turn that string into a number, that number into a string so I can compare them. If I do that and I get the same value, they are loosely equal. If we're doing strict equality, they have to be the same value and the same type. I'm not allowed to change the type of one of them to make them equal. They have to be the same. Okay. And that applies for our not equals operators also. So you can do not and one equal sign or not and two equal signs, and that will be not equal loosely or strictly. Okay. So when it comes to null and undefined, they mean very similar things, but they're not strictly equal. They are loosely equal. And this is why. So the idea of null is that it is an empty value on purpose, is the way I tend to think of it. So we can set the value of a variable or a property in an object to null on purpose. And what we're communicating there is there's nothing here. This is empty on purpose. Okay. So maybe you have, a user fill out a profile and they have an optional favorite color and they don't answer it. We could set that value to null on the user object, and we're saying they chose not to answer this. It's null. Undefined means we have declared the variable, but not given it a value. So it's literally not defined. Because they're loosely equal, you can kind of treat them similarly in JavaScript. So if you make something undefined or null, and then you check if it's there or not, if it's true or false, they will both come back as false. And if you loosely compare them, they will be equal. But if you strictly compare them, null is only equal to itself. And that gets weird here in two other places. So when they get coerced to a number, they behave differently. So if you coerce undefined to a number, you're going to get that NaN value we looked at last time, that not a number. I can't turn undefined into a number. If you turn null into a number, though, you'll get 0. Because again, JavaScript's intention there is that null is us intentionally saying there's nothing here, it's an empty value, so that's equivalent to 0. But if we haven't defined it yet, then we can't make it into a number because we don't know if you meant 0. It's just not defined yet. Okay. So that one can be a gotcha if you're not being careful about null versus undefined and you are doing math anywhere for sure. Ooh, apparently peace signs make balloons. This Google AI stuff is cracking me up. Zoom AI. Okay. So the other place that gets really weird, and do not store this in your brain. Forget it immediately after I say it. It's one of the weird, there's an entire website called JavaScript WTF or WTFJS.com that has a collection of all of these weird things. JavaScript's been around for a long time. It started primarily as really minimal interactivity in the browser, and now we use it to do all kinds of stuff. And so there's some historical kind of buggy, weird stuff in JavaScript that we just haven't changed in the language, because if we did, it would break a lot of existing JavaScript in the world. So one of the things you'll notice that is weird, and this is one of them, is that if you ask JavaScript what the type of null is, it's an object. It is not really an object, but it is for dumb historical JS reasons. So if you ever for some reason run type of on null and you get object and you say WTF, you now can also post to WTF.js. I'm going to ignore that line now. Okay. So that's null and undefined. So they mean very similar things. We don't really have a value here, but null is empty intentionally, and undefined means I don't know what it is. Maybe. Okay. Cool. So for all these primitives we just talked about, they are immutable. So we're going to talk real briefly about the idea of mutability. Anybody know what mutable versus immutable means here?
Can't change it?
Yeah, you can't change it. That's going to seem real weird here in a second when we get to arrays and I make an array that's immutable and then I change it. And then you're going to say, wait, don't worry about it. We'll explain that. We're not actually changing the array in that case, but they are immutable. So a string, once it's defined, is that string. You cannot mutate that string. A number, once it's defined, is that number. You cannot mutate that number. Do not confuse this with variables, which are, well, variable, right? So we say we have a variable like foo or x, and we assign it a number or a string. That variable, we can change the number or the string that's in there all we want. That variable is like a container, right? But the actual string we placed in there, we can't mutate directly. If we change the value of that variable, we're just giving it a new string. We're replacing the old one with a new one. We're not mutating the old one. So that's the thing. Mutability is a whole deep topic we could spend an entire module on, but just a thing to know. We've covered all the number stuff. I think that's what I have to say about the basics of the primitive types. I mentioned they have no properties or objects, and yet we're about to do a bunch of stuff with array methods and string methods and properties. And here's how that works. I'm going to go over this in a real high level. This is also one I wouldn't devote too much brain space to, but it is going to give you hopefully a useful mental model for thinking about why this works the way it does. So when you have a string or a number and you start accessing properties on it, like length or string.split or something like that, if they're primitive values that I already defined as having no methods or properties, how the heck are we doing that? Well, JavaScript is trying to be really nice to you, and it does a bunch of magic right under the hood whenever you try to do that. And it does this thing that is often called auto boxing. So basically, when you say, hey, I want to call a method on this string, it creates a new string with a capital S, not the lowercase s that's our primitive, a new string object, puts your string inside of it, and that wrapper object has all those methods and properties, so we can manipulate the string on the inside and get a new one back or whatever. Same thing works with numbers. So when we were doing that little math versus string example last class, where I did the number of string 1 plus number of string 2, this is like explicitly boxing them up. I'm taking this value and putting it inside a number object. So that's not the number primitive, it's a number object that will give me back a number primitive when I need it. Okay. And that's how it works with all of these. So when you start calling methods on a string or methods on an array, et cetera, you're getting an object wrapped around the thing that has all that stuff on it. I'm not going to go into the nitty gritties of how that works. If somebody wants to rabbit hole into that, I'm glad to do it offline or outside of class. But just kind of realize that that's what's happening. You're getting these ephemeral objects. So when I said ephemeral, meaning they only exist temporarily, right? So when we say, and this is part of why the string mutation doesn't work. So if I say, I'm going to call a method on a string, it's going to wrap a string up in an object, let me call that method, give me back the result of what I did, and destroy that object it created. So I now am back to my primitive string again. And so you can't really like hang on to those ephemeral objects. They're getting created and destroyed automatically by JavaScript, which is kind of magic and means we don't have to think about it too much. We can just do stuff to strings and numbers and arrays. But again, this is one of those places where if you don't have at least a basic idea that that's what's happening, you may discover some weird behavior and not understand why it's happening. So just realize we're boxing these values up in objects. I literally wrote, don't think about it too much. It's a useful mental model though. All right, any questions on the 7 primitives for now? It's okay, we're going to keep revisiting all this stuff over and over again. You guys are awesome. All right, everything else in JavaScript is an object. Objects can have one of three things inside of them, not including the ephemeral things we were just talking about. An object. So wait, we can put an object inside an object? Yes, yeah, that's what happens. So when we define a plain JavaScript object, like you were doing in your dragon slaying, where you just said, you know, here's a location, it's curly braces with some properties in it. That's an object in an object. So it's the type is object, and it has an object literal inside of it, which is just curly braces with our pairs. We're going to look at one of those in a second here. It can have an array in it. So arrays are objects. I know that's weird. They're objects with a capital O. And it can have a date, and we'll deal with the date object a couple classes from now. It's its own can of worms that is a bit of a thing to wrap your head around. Okay, so that's essentially what we have with objects. They're either going to be an object literal or an array, or occasionally a date object. All right. So speaking of objects, we've been dealing, you all came into this module with some background in HTML and CSS. And I think it was Neil last class who asked, somebody mentioned the DOM. And I said we'd be getting into that in this class. So the DOM is the way in which JavaScript allows us to interact with all that HTML and CSS you've been writing, right? So we talked a little bit last class about a document and the concept of markup languages, right? And so our HTML and our CSS produce this document. And then the browser parses that document and creates the document object model, which is literally an object that represents the document. That's all it is. So don't overcomplicate breaking down that technical acronym. It is a model of the document as an object. That's all it is. Okay. And because we now have the whole document represented as JavaScript objects, we can interact with it like we could with any other JavaScript object. And so this is what's allowed you in the dragon slaying game to, you know, change the text inside of a button. You were grabbing the object in the document object model that represented that button and changing its text property. And so when we deal with any sort of interactive manipulation, whether that's later when you get into React or now while we're doing it with just vanilla JavaScript, on some level, that is how all of that interactivity works. We're basically creating kind of two copies of the document. So we have the actual document that's rendered on the page for the user, and then we have the document object model that's sort of underlying that. And so when JavaScript makes a change, it updates the document object model, and then the browser re-renders the document to match the new model, if that makes sense. That's the basic process of how we're changing things. So we update the object, and then the browser says, oh, the object changed. I should redraw the page with the new object. Okay, so let's take a look at that. In the in-class document for today, and I pushed all this stuff up on GitHub last night, so in the curriculum, all these links and stuff are in there for you, in case you're having a hard time seeing or want to be able to click stuff. This is the Mozilla MDN section on the document object model. So it goes into great depth about it. And I just put that there for your convenience to read into as much or as little as you'd like to rabbit hole into that technical implementation stuff. I'm going to take a kind of higher level pass at it for you now. And then you can figure out where you want to go from there. Okay, so the basic, there is a core element when we're building the DOM, and that core element is a node. Okay, and you can think of the node as a specific type of an object. Okay, I mention here that it's an abstract object, and the reason what that means here, this is kind of an object-oriented programming term, and we're not really going to get into that here too much, but the idea is that like we never actually use a node directly. The node is sort of a parent umbrella that says anything that goes into the document has to meet the like form and shape of a node. When we actually use it, it has to get converted into one of these three concrete types. So a node will always either be, at least under the current web API spec till they change that some years from now, a document, an element, or a document fragment. We're not going to worry much about the document fragment right now. It's just a lightweight alternative to the document for when you have like nothing but a single page without much going on in it. You can use document fragments to kind of simplify that. We're just going to focus on document and element. Okay. So I've got an example of the DOM here. So let's take a look here. This is an incomplete piece of HTML. Okay. I'll zoom in one more just because these are small enough, making it really easy to see. So I don't have any of the sort of boilerplate wrapping elements. I just have a few HTML tags here. This is a valid fragment of HTML, right? So we've got a div. The div's got an H1 in it. It's got a paragraph in it. It's got a little list in it. End of div. That's my entire little HTML sample here, right? I've fleshed this out into what the DOM looks like in a slightly simplified version. So let's look at what this looks like here. So again, this is a little oversimplified, but it's pretty accurate. So we've got the DOM, and it's just a JavaScript object. So here's an object containing an object. I just said it's a variable with curly braces, so I've made an object literal. I'm just literally specifying what this object is, right? Okay. So in that object we have some root level at the first indent. My nice little indent rainbow helping me out here. At the first indent of this core object, we have the root element, which often will be something else, and we'll talk about that in a second. But right now it's that div. Okay. So the root element of this whole thing, remember when we were looking at this here, actually, let me here, I can split this right. And we can look at it like this. That's probably easier to see. Okay, so this tag name div is referring to this tag right here, and it has some attributes, right? We have an ID attribute, which contains the string container. We have a class attribute, which contains the string main container. Then it has some children, which is an array. So square brackets dictate an array here, right? And if we look at our HTML structure, that's what we see. The div is the only thing with the only root level element that has children. So if I fold up this children array for a second, this is our whole DOM, right? If I just look at the root element and I can fold up this div in the same way, this is what we're currently looking at. Does this make sense to everybody so far? We have a JavaScript object with some properties. And so all a basic JavaScript object is essentially key value pairs. So we have a string for the property name and then some value. And that value can be any other valid JavaScript value, anything you'd put in a variable. So it can be another object, it can be an array, it can be a string, it can be a number. In object literals in JavaScript, keys have to be strings or symbols. They can't be anything else, just so you're aware of that. Actually, I think they might only have to be strings. You might only be able to use symbols and maps. I don't remember what that restriction is or not. So we have string names here. Notice these aren't quoted. Oops, and I just jacked that one up. Because you have to use strings as keys in a JavaScript object literal, you don't have to quote them. You can, but it will assume that that's a string value as the key, because that's how it works. So it's pretty common to write them this way, where you don't quote the property name, but you do quote the string value, because you'd have to here, because your values aren't required to be strings. They could be anything. Okay, so here we have our root element. It's got some attributes. Cool. We're going to open this guy back up, and we're going to open up its children. All right. And now our first child of our div element here is this H1 element, right? Our little header that says hello world inside of it. If you'd all like to see this page, just so we can get a browser example too, I'll pull it over here on another tab real quick. So this is what we are looking at here. Notice that even though I just got some warnings from live server here about I don't have a header body tag, it's still rendered in the browser. So here's our page, right? There's our H1 tag, our P tag, and then our little list. So one of the things I want to point out here is that despite me not having a head or a body tag, the browser was still able to render the page. So early on in the early days of the web, which some of you are probably too young to remember, but that's okay. The web was very new and very brittle, and we were breaking it all of the time, and we weren't sure how it was going to work. And we decided that since this whole web was a new thing, it was going to be really bad user experience if every time something was broken on a web page in a minor way, like somebody forgot the closing head tag, the whole page just broke, because we wanted people to adopt this technology and use it. And so browsers were inherently written to be as permissive as possible. So they will just do their best and spit it out. So if you forget, if you don't write a head tag at all, they'll go, yeah, it probably needs a head tag. We'll just insert one at the top. Let's actually look at our DOM here for a second. Notice I have a head tag and I have a body tag. The browser just made those up because they have to exist. I also have an HTML tag wrapping the outside of those. The browser will just insert them. The browser will do the same thing with missing closing tags. So if you forget to close a tag, it will insert a closing tag somewhere. It may not insert it in the right place where you meant for it to go, which may break things about your page, but it will still try to render it and spit it out. So just a thing to sort of be aware of there. But this is the page we're dealing with here. Okay, and we'll pull this back off the screen for a second. So as we look at the next layer down of the DOM here into our children, here's this H1 element. So notice it's got the same property as our outer root element, tag name, but now it's an H1 tag instead of a div tag, right? So that's referring to this part right here. It also has some attributes, right? We have a class attribute with the string title. Over here in our attributes object, we have class with the string title. Okay, and then in our children, notice that its children array does not have another object in it because what's inside this H1 tag is just text content. So it has a text node. That's it. No new object in there. Okay. And that's how that works. Now we're going to move down to the next child, which is this P tag here. Notice that these are on the same level, right? So if you remember when you're like adding locations in your role-playing game to your locations array, like they're all on the root level. This is just an array of objects, right? So I can close, can I not fold this one? You're going to fold the whole thing, aren't you? There. Children. Okay, this is kind of an interesting way to look at it, and that's what I was trying to get to here. So you see my children right here, I've got three objects, right? You see an open closing brace and a curly closing brace separated by a comma 3 times. So notice these folding regions. This is really helpful for you to catch errors like those of you that were running into problems. I think it was a common problem where a few people missed commas between their locations or between properties in their locations in the role-playing game. If you do this folding region stuff, often you will get a clue that like your editor can't figure out how to fold your object up correctly because you haven't actually structured it right. So that and syntax highlighting are going to be big helps that you don't get. You get a little syntax highlighting in the free code camp interface, but not nearly this level of it. So that's another thing you can do if you're ever unsure about something you've typed in. Grab that whole script.js out of the free code camp you're working on and just paste it into VS Code and see where you're getting weird syntax highlighting and stuff. Okay, so that's our whole H1 element there, right? So I'm just going to close up our H1 guy here, and let's look at the next child, which is our P tag, right? Same idea, got a P. Notice its attributes is an empty object because this P tag has no attributes, no classes, no style tags, no anything else inside that tag. So attributes would be an empty object. And then its only child is, again, text content. So its children array is just this string. This is a sample paragraph, right? And then last but not least, we have this UL tag here, which also has no attributes. So empty object because it has no attributes in our HTML. And if we open up its children array, oh, look, we got 3 more objects in there. Those are going to be these 3 list item elements, right? So when I open one of those up, tag name list item, it has no attributes again, so an empty object, and its child is just a string. So it just has the text node. And those are all going to look the same, except the string is different, right? So you can kind of see how that gets structured. Just making some sense? Mayhaps?
Is the DOM something that we will commonly write, or is it?
No,
something-
absolutely not. The browser builds this for you. It's how when you interact with the browser via JavaScript, you're interacting with it. I just know when I've tried to explain the DOM or had people just try to read about the DOM and make sense of it, not understanding that it's just a JavaScript object has made it seem more mysterious than it really is. And also we're just learning about objects. So I thought this was a useful way to double dip that and say, here's what the browser is really doing. And also here's how JavaScript objects work. So that's why we're looking at it this way. You'll never write the DOM from scratch. The browser will build the DOM, you will interact with and manipulate it. And we're going to look at some of those methods now. Okay. Close this up real quick. Let's go back here for a second. Okay. So this is kind of what we're just getting at here in response to Dancy's question about like how we actually interact with the DOM. So a few really common methods, some of which you might have already touched. But let's talk about constructing the DOM first. So like, there may be a case where, while we're not going to write that whole DOM object from scratch, we want to add a new list item, right? We want to insert a whole new HTML tag that isn't in the markup. So the browser won't have added that node to the DOM. We have to do that. And so we have some ways to do that. So document create element is a method that should have parentheses after it. And that will let us just create a new element. And then we can attach it to our current document, right? Put it somewhere. We can use element.append or node.append child to tell it where to attach it. There's other methods also, but these are some of the most common. So if I used element.append and I grabbed, say, that UL tag, our unordered list in the example, and I appended another LI to it, it would add it to its children array at the end of the array. Okay, and we're going to look at arrays here in a second, so we'll kind of do a real world example of that. So we have these methods on document, on the node prototype, and on element that let us actually create new chunks of DOM and insert them. But we're not going to just write a DOM object. We'll call these methods that will build up that whole new tag and shove it in there for us. Okay. And then for things that already exist in the DOM, and we've definitely touched some of these already, we have things like document.querySelector or querySelectorAll or getElementById. And all of those are just going back to look at that DOM object we were just looking at to go find the thing that matches what you told it to look for, right? So they're functions on the document class or the element class that let us do that. So that's the two common ways we're going to interact with the DOM are using like create element or append to attach new DOM nodes to the existing DOM or remove them. There's also remove delete methods. Or we're going to grab an existing element with query selector, et cetera, and then do something to it, either attach a new child to it or change its content or change an attribute or whatever. And so that's how we're going to interact with the DOM is via the methods that are exposed on these document element and node classes. Okay. And if you're ever curious about what all the things are that you can do there, if you just look at I thought I linked this in here, but maybe I did not. Just pull tab over here. So for instance, this is the document interface. MDN is my go-to for this stuff. If you're not already using it, highly recommend. But you can see all these instance properties listed. So these are all the properties I can access on the document. And if I close that list up, here's all the methods I can call on it. So here's create element, but you can see there's a ton of them. You should not get in the habit of trying to memorize all the JavaScript methods. It will not serve you. You'll never remember them all. And you need brain space to think about the problem you're trying to solve in the code. So when I talk about being able to read JavaScript and read the code, this is kind of part of what I'm getting at is like, know what you need to go look up and think about the structure. So I want to do something on the document. There's got to be a method that does that. It's probably named something that makes sense. I'm going to go look at the document class in the reference for the web API and figure out what properties I can play with on it and what methods I can call on it and how that's going to be useful to me. Okay. So, and you can do that. So that's for the document and you get the same thing for element, right? So if I look at the element API, we've got all of these properties. There are a lot of them because this is how basically everything in the browser works in an HTML page nowadays. But I can call has attribute on an element to find out if it has a certain attribute. I can, here's our query selector and query selector all, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. So we are by no means going to touch all the available methods or properties on any of these types. That goes for arrays, objects, everything else. So get used to being able to like just look them up in the reference and see what's available to you. Because that's going to be super helpful. And when we get into functions in more depth in an upcoming class, I'm going to talk a little bit more about how to read function signatures and how that's going to be more useful to you when you're looking at those docs. We'll try to maybe touch on that a little today. Cool. So I want to take a quick look at one part of this DOM example and ask you all a little quiz about it. I kind of hinted at some of it already. Let's flip this out so we can see what we're doing again. Okay, So clearly, this, as I mentioned, this document here is incomplete. This is not, this did render out in the browser, but I haven't actually like, filled out the whole HTML. So what are some of the things I'm missing that we should absolutely have? I've kind of hinted these.
Doc type,
Sorry?
doc type.
Yeah, we need a doc type a doc type declaration, right? So I can just throw that in here for funsies. And that threw the other things in there I was going to ask you about too, but I didn't. Because so it's funny. I was revisiting some of the free code camp stuff and realized that I don't know what's in a doc type declaration anymore. I know what all this means. I haven't actually typed one out by hand in probably 2 years. So I either have to Google it or boilerplate it. I know what all these things do, but it's one of those things that, again, as I mentioned in the earlier tasks, the way I recommend learning this stuff as far as using tools like AI or snippets or anything else that speeds up your boilerplate, type the boilerplate out, the doc type things you're doing every time, the beginning of your JavaScript, till you know what everything in it does and you feel like you could explain it like I was 5. And then at that point, you can fire up that snippet and just kick it out. And that's true of any code you're going to get from ChatGPT or anything else, in my opinion. If you're going to use any of those tools, they're very powerful and they have a lot of good usage. You should not use them while you're learning if you can't explain exactly what the code it just gave you does. Okay, so don't ever just take code that Emmet or a snippet or ChatGPT or anything spits out for you and just use it because you're assuming it's right. If you look at the output of whatever tool you're using to help speed that stuff up and can't read it, then you need to write the code yourself and figure it out, because that's where you're going to actually understand it and put it in your fingers. When I was learning JavaScript the first time, I even didn't really copy and paste very much, because there is something tactile about having to type it that helps you kind of slow down a little bit and think through what you're doing, and then you kind of remember some of that stuff. So that's my advice on that. Okay, so I'm going to simplify what this just added a little bit. The doc type declaration is fine. Well, it's fine. So let's change this to document. So this is my root document element now. Now I got some problems because this is not the right thing. Let's just go ahead and say that the only thing my document has at the root level is children. Okay, and then I'm going to grab all of this stuff and put it inside the children of my document. If I had prettier turned on, that would have just auto indented for me. So there you go. There's another reason to do that. But apparently I haven't been doing JavaScript and VS Code for a while, so I must not have some formatting stuff set up very nicely here. What are you mad about, ESLint? I missed a comma somewhere? I don't believe you. Oh, yes, I did, because this needs to be an object. Isn't it fun when you screw up your structure in front of everybody else in a live coding session and you're zoomed in too far to see it? All right, so what I did here, we've got a document element here, and then our document element is going to have a children array, and that children array is going to have all of our other stuff in it, which includes our root div here, which has children, and I need to get down to the end of its children here and close that tag up. There we go. All right, so the problem I had there was that this div element was originally wrapped by these curly braces, and when I shoved it all inside of child, I did not add a new closing curly brace to wrap that up. And that's where all the syntax highlighting and coloring and indent rainbow helps you figure out where your structure is broken. So at least for me, I really start to think about these square brackets and these curly brackets as literal containers. Just like when you were learning HTML, you were thinking about your open and closing tag brackets, right? But really you're thinking about them as tags. Like over here, we've got an opening list item tag and a closing list item tag. That gives me a nice little container that I can put stuff in. Start thinking about your brackets the same way. They're containers. And so they have to have an opening and a closing, and then stuff is shoved inside of them. And that stuff is shoved inside of other stuff. And they're all separated, typically by commas and these things. So cool. All right, so now I've extracted out to document. I'm still not quite there, right? Because we haven't addressed adding head or body. I'm going to kind of sort of cheat and say that my root document element here is this HTML tag. So what we could do to be consistent is say our tag name is HTML and it has one attribute in this object, which is what? What's our one attribute of the HTML element? Make the connection for me, guys. The answer's on the left, on line 2.
Language.
That's it. So that's gonna look like that, right? And then it's got children. And its children are actually head and body, right? And then all of this stuff is in the body. So if we were gonna actually be clear about that, we need to create a body tag here. So let's create that and then we'll put this stuff in the right spot. Tag name, body. I'm going to skip over the head because we're not going to redo all this. I'm just going to kind of wrap this bit up here. So we're going to say we have tag name body. Our body has, almost made a mistake. I was going to make you all catch. Our body has attributes, but it doesn't have any. So that's just going to be an empty object, right? And then it also is going to have an array of children. And I'm going to open that up because our array of children is all down here, right? Move those guys inside of there. And I should really turn on prettier before the next class so that my stuff formats like yours does. Oh, use TypeScript and JavaScript language features. Thanks. There we go. Okay. I just had VS Code auto format it for me since I don't have it turned on to do that on save apparently for JavaScript currently, or not configured right on this repo. So, okay. So now we can see we've got our document, our HTML element. It has children. There's a head tag that goes in here, but I've skipped it. And then we've got our body element, which has no attributes on it directly, but it does have children. And then our children array is all the stuff we already had looked at, the previous sort of full DOM. Okay. You can see if I was going to add a head element, it's going to go right here, right? It'd be tag name head, and then we carry on. It would have attributes and children, et cetera. And so this whole nested structure just continues to get constructed. Is that making sense?
Yeah, quick question.
Yep.
If on the body, since you don't have any attributes, I mean, you might have already touched on it, but I'm not sure. Why would you have to put that there if you don't have any?
You don't necessarily. So it depends on how it's being used, right? And I don't, this is we'd get too far into the weeds of specific browser APIs, et cetera, to untangle the specifics of the body element specifically in this case. But if we had code that specifically looked for the attributes key on a node and it wasn't there, that might cause an error, right? If we handle that appropriately and say, well, if it's not there, then just assume it's empty and we don't have any attributes, then that would be fine to just omit it altogether. I'm doing it here only for clarity, to specify that every element you create in the DOM will have a tag name, it will have an attributes key, and it will have a children key. That children might be an empty array and the attributes might be an empty object, but they do exist. So if I create an empty element and that has no children, I can ask for its children and I will get back an empty array. So this is what you're going to get back as the value for attributes if you ask for it on the body in the DOM as an empty object. You won't get null. So that's kind of how that goes. Cool. Any questions on DOM at this point? Hopefully this gives you a little bit of a clue as to how when you were, changing the text inside your buttons or adding a location or any of that sort of stuff that you could see you were changing text nodes when you're setting inner HTML or text content, right? So setting inner HTML is literally just, modifying what's nested inside of that object in the DOM, right? It's going to add the right new elements. Setting text content is going to modify the children of that node and set the text properties of them, etc. And so again, you're manipulating those properties that I was showing you in the MDN link a minute ago, where you can look at an element or look at a node and look at a document, and those are all the things you can do to it. And this is what's getting manipulated by JavaScript under the hood. And then the browser, every time that changes, just re-renders it and says, oh, now the page should look like this, because this is now the structure of my document. So that's how the DOM works, folks. And that's a good intro to JS objects as well, which we'll spend plenty more time on. All right. So next, let's do some actual interacting with the DOM here. So to do that, we need some JavaScript, right? I don't need this one. I'm just going to use the HTML guy here. Okay, so let's shove some JavaScript in this thing. Since I already have it open as a page, we can look at, I think I still have it open over here, right? So just a reminder now, this is what's sitting up here on our live server. Fancy page. Does so many good things, okay? Let's add some stuff to it for fun, since we already have a file working. So we want to add some JavaScript to this. What do I need to do? What's the easiest way for me to just throw some JavaScript in here? Sorry?
Script tag.
Yep. So let's just do it right here to start. And as we did last class, I could just write arbitrary JavaScript right in here, right? Pretty quickly, unless you're writing very small amounts of JavaScript, that's going to get kind of tedious and messy. I'm assuming in module 1, I wasn't there for all of it, you all did style tags similar to script tags, and then you went to a style sheet where you put your CSS in another file. Yes? No? Yeah.
Yep.
Same idea here, right? If you're doing a minimal amount of styling, a style tag is fine in the document. As soon as it gets to be a bunch of CSS, it's annoying to have all that sitting in your HTML file, and it makes it harder to reuse. Same is true for the JavaScript. Exactly the same idea. I can write JavaScript in here. If it's going to be more than a line or two of JavaScript, or I want to reuse it, and be happier putting it in another file. Do that in a kind of similar fashion, kind of closer to how you deal with an image. So here we're just going to do a source tag, and I've already started a basically empty file, dialog.js, and that's in the same folder I'm in, so I can just link it directly with no path or anything. Okay. So now I've created a script element in my DOM with a source attribute that has this string, which is a file path, as its only attribute, right? And so this is effectively the same as me writing all of the JavaScript in between these script tags that exists in this file, which is currently none. So now when I go back to our page, nothing's changed here at all, except now we can see that I do in fact have a script tag here that is loading that file. Okay. Cool. All right, so we're going to try and do some stuff here. We're going to talk and interact with a user in a very simple way. Obviously, we don't have like authentication or password stuff set up or anything. But the browser API gives us a few kind of straightforward ways to interact with the user without us having to do much extra work. And so one of them is alert, which we looked at last class briefly, where we can just create a pop-up that displays a message. Confirm is another one, which displays a message and lets you say yes or no. But in this case, we want the user to give us back some stuff so we can play with it. So we're going to use the third one, which is prompt. And so prompt will let us display a message in a pop-up, but it will give the user a text input where they can put a response in. And we will get the value of what they entered there returned to us from that prompt function. So let's go ahead and do that. We're going to ask the user for their name. So I'm going to assume their name doesn't change once they tell us what it is. So I'm going to use a const, and I'm going to say name equals, and we're going to prompt them and say, please enter first and last name. Something like that. You all are hopefully playing along at home here. So, or at the Verge or wherever you all are, Gitbit, etc. Okay, so Now, the only other thing I'm going to do with it here for now is just log out the result of that so we can see what happened. So let's go ahead and log out. Actually, I'll make it even easier for us to see. Let's go ahead and just alert. Hello. With a space. And then we learned this one last time. So I'm going to do some basic string concatenation and I'm going to chuck name at the end of that there. Okay. Let's see what happens now when we refresh our page. Oh, look. It almost gave me a thing, but not quite. I didn't actually get a prompt here. Because I needed to refresh, because it auto refreshed. I must have hit save while I was adding the prompt function. Okay, so please enter first and last name. My name is Eric Kyle. Oh, hello, Eric Kyle. Magic, we just did JavaScript. We've interacted with the user. Somebody's got to have a question about what I just did, or not. That's okay, but
And on that webpage, Eric,
sorry?
will you zoom in on the webpage?
Yeah. See if I can get the. I guess I can't really zoom the pop-ups very easily. I could
Yeah.
change screen resolution, but just gave me a little pop-up that says, please enter first and last name. I typed in my first and last name, and now I got a pop-up here that says hello and my name in it.
I have a question.
Yep.
Is the data that you just entered only saved as long as the page isn't refreshed?
Correct. Because that script tag is going to get, this script will get executed every time that script tag gets hit. And so every time it gets hit, it's going to initialize a variable called name to whatever the result of this prompt is. We could absolutely persist. So that's the question you're asking about. The term for that is persistence. So you're asking about persistence. This data is not persistent because we're not persisting it anywhere else. We're not putting it to local storage or a database or some other place where we could get it back later. We
Okay.
could, and we'll look at this later when we get into Boolean logic in another class, but we could do something like store this in local storage, which is some storage you can access on the browser itself where you can store little temporary values. Don't ever put anything secure in there because it's visible to whoever's got access to the browser, by the way. So not a good place for things like passwords and stuff, or sensitive data. Warning on local storage. That's a whole other topic. But we could store this name in local storage, and then we could wrap this in a check where we'd say every time the page loads, go look at local storage and see if we have a name in there. And if we do, just say hello. And if we don't, then prompt them for their name. Right? So that's kind of how you would think about some persistent stuff.
Got it.
Good question. Why are you crossing out name on me? That's weird. Something in TypeScript thinks name is a deprecated TypeScripty thing that has nothing to do with anything we're doing. So we're going to ignore that. I'll bet if I just change the name of that, it doesn't care anymore. So if we make this username. Yeah, it doesn't care anymore. Name is a special word for something that was deprecated at some point, and so it was warning me about that. So same difference here. Cool. Casing convention, since I just touched on that. When you name variables in JavaScript, the convention is camel case, which is what this is. So lowercase and then a capital letter to separate words, but not a first capital letter, which is considered Pascal case or title case. That is reserved in JavaScript. Typically, that convention is for object instances that get created by classes and stuff that we're not going to touch on right now. But for you notice that like when we did number of something, that is a capital N because that is the number object. So we're creating a new object of number type. And so that would be that number class or the string class. Those are the start with a capital. So when you see capital case things in JavaScript, you can assume they're constructing an object of some type for you. And you should follow that same convention. And if you're just making a regular variable that has multiple words jammed together in it, the convention in JavaScript is camel case. Different languages have different conventions for that, but that's the kind of standard for JS. It technically doesn't matter. I can absolutely do this. And as long as I do it here also, then it just works. But you would confuse somebody else, including future you, when you look at this code later, when you get used to that convention and realize that that's not an object constructor, it's just a variable. Okay. So that's really the only primary reason for that casing, is to try to help us keep ourselves straight about where stuff is coming from. Okay, cool. So now let's, instead of responding with this alert, let's go ahead and say, add a little greeting message to the top of our page. So we could do this in a few ways. We could modify the existing text inside of a node that's already in the DOM to have the user greeting. We could create a new element that contains that user greeting and attach it to our existing document, right? So we have kind of two flavors for that. So let's look at the first one, the sort of simplest one, which is let's change an existing node first. So what do we have to play with in here already? We have this ID container, this class. So let's go ahead and write some markup here first to just give us a greeting message. So maybe instead of hello world here, we want hello world to just go ahead and say hello, whatever your name is, right? So it's going to say hello world till we have that prompt, and we want to change the text here on the inside. So let's do that. So after we get the name, let's get our title. So I'll call it title display equals. And how are we going to go get this thing from the DOM, friends? Here's our current markup. There are a few ways we could do it.
Class.
Sorry?
Oh, class title.
Yep, we could go after class title. That will also grab any other elements with the class title, but it's currently the only one we have, so that would work as unique. Similarly, we could go after the tag. We could get it by the H1 tag. We could also look for things that have this text content, etc. But I think for now, class title is going to be fine with us. We're going to assume that our current page is going to have no other, that title class is specifically for this element, and that's why we're using it. And we'll just roll with that.
You give it a specific like ID to call, so it'd be unique.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch that.
Would you give it an ID, like, since the class could be could be reusable, if you wanted to specifically call this, would you give it like a unique ID?
That would be the more explicit way to do this, yes. So we could absolutely, so let's look at both options here. So we could do, this is going to be a document method. So we could do document query selector. We only want the first one, and we could go get it by title. And that's going to give us back that element. But as we've just pointed out, if I am just using title for styling all my title elements on a page, and I have more than one title, it might be an accessibility concern, but that's a different problem. Then this will grab the first one, which in this case might still be the right one. But if I add a new element that has class title before this one, it's going to grab that one instead, right? So it's potentially squishy. I use the term squishy grape a lot, which is a Karate Kid reference. If you don't know it, we can talk about that another time. So this is a bit of a squishy grape, which means it's a potential bug, right? It isn't a bug yet, but if we added another element with the class title and it comes before this one, we might grab the wrong element. So probably a safer call, since we want this greeting to always land in one place, to do exactly what was suggested. We can leave the class title there for styling it, but we can give it an ID, and we'll call it greeting. I'm kind of fussy about my indentation and styling for stuff, so you all are gonna just, I don't have this one set up to do it the way I like it, but I like my tags to look like that, because then I know what the heck is happening. Okay, so now we have this ID greeting. I'm gonna go grab it that way instead. So what method are we gonna use to get it instead of query selector then? I could still use query selector, right? Sorry. How do I get that by, what goes in here now?
Hashtag.
greeting.
Yep. So that works. What's the other way I could get that same one? Do this one too, and then that goes away, right? because I don't need to specify it's an ID because this function only looks at IDs. Cool. So now we have that. So how do I then make this say hello to our user? What's my next step? So many things I could do here. So we've got inner text, we've got text content, we've got inner HTML. What's the choice here, friends? I need to set a property on it, right? We want to change the text on the inside.
Inner text.
Mhm. There are subtle differences between inner text and text content, and you can look those up on the MDN as well. The inner text basically only shows you the human readable stuff on the inside, and text content will show you script stuff and everything else that's in there too, if you need it. So we're going to set inner text. Okay, and we already did this in our alert, so we'll just do the same thing. We'll do hello plus username. Yeah, cool. So let me pull this guy back over here for us to look at again, and let's refresh my page. You can see it, the initial DOM state loaded with hello world is that text because that's what's in the HTML before the script tag got run. And now we're getting the prompt here. And now it says hello to me. Oh, but we lost our exclamation point and our comma. It's not nearly as friendly. Let's go make it a little more friendly. So instead of just hello plus username, let's do our comma here. And notice I have the space here that I'm going to want when I concatenate because the variable won't have the space in it. And then we can do our exclamation point at the end. So this is string concatenation and how you one way you can build up a string to do a thing here, right? And so now to your earlier question about let me refresh to your earlier question about the data persistence issue. Look at this. When I closed my prompt out, now I get hello null because I didn't answer the prompt. So it returned null as the value, which if you coerce null to a string here, it's actually in text content, you're getting null. So but you can see now we've got a nice little comma and a nice little greeting, and yay, it's nice to us, right? So there's another way we can build up a string like this, and you're going to deal with this a lot in your homework. So we're going to visit it now. And that's this idea of what's called a template literal. And this is a fairly newish thing in JavaScript. And this is where backticks come in. So notice already I did a really weird thing in the string concatenation. I used double quotes here and single quotes on my exclamation point. JavaScript don't care. They're interchangeable, sort of. Okay.
Mine didn't work really well.
Sorry? The question? Okay. So they're interchangeable, sort of, right? They are interchangeable in that whatever you open with, if you open your string with a single quote or double quote, you got to close it with the same one. And so that means like if I wanted this to actually be in quotes on the inside, I can wrap hello in single quotes and it's actually going to print those out. So if I go back here and reload our page, you can see it printed the first one anyway. And I got weird stuff going on in here now. Should have printed the second one too. That's weird. Yeah, okay. So you can see it printed my single quotes out. I just caught it mid update. So single quotes will get escaped inside of double quotes and vice versa. So if you need to actually print quotes out to the page, if you want to print double quotes, then wrap that string in single quotes and your double quotes will just get auto escaped and get actually printed. They won't get treated like they're starting a new string. And vice versa is true. If you start it with singles on the outside, you can use doubles on the inside and it won't break your string up. If that doesn't work for you for some reason, you can also escape them. So if I really wanted this wrapped in double quotes, but I also wanted to print a set of double quotes around this, I can do this and put a backslash in front of those. And you can see they got colored slightly differently. This means hey, JavaScript, don't treat this as a JavaScript double quote for me breaking up strings. Print it like a literal character of the double quotes, right? And so now when I come back here and refresh and give it a name, caught it mid-update again. There you go. Now you can see it's printed by double quotes, okay? So that works either way. You can escape singles inside a single or doubles inside of a double with a backslash. But the most common practice is just to use the opposite one you need on the outside, and then you can print the literal one on the inside. But there's use cases for both. They do the same thing effectively. In other languages, single quotes and double quotes are not the same thing, so don't assume that that's standard. But they're interchangeable in JavaScript aside from that escaping piece. I tend to personally use single quotes all the time because I'm a keystrokes person, and it's one less key every time I type a string. And often your HTML attributes are all in double quotes. So if you're writing HTML in a JavaScript string, having your JavaScript string in single quotes means you can use the double quotes for your HTML attributes without having to escape them. And that's also convenient. So my default is single quotes and double quotes when they need to be doubles. But you can do whatever makes you happy. They're all pretty interchangeable. But you can see where this string concatenation of having to do plus and another thing and plus another thing could start to get really annoying if we're inserting multiple variables in a simple sentence. So this is where template literals get really powerful. So with template literals, we're going to do backticks instead. So that's the top left of your keyboard with the same key as the tilde there. And what this allows us to do is what's called string interpolation. So we're going to say everything inside these backticks is a string, except where I insert some special syntax that says, ooh, this is a variable you should expand out. So to get the same message here now, I can still do my double quotes if I want and say, hello, comma. And now I'm going to do a $sign and curly braces. And you notice my colors just changed in my syntax highlighting, because now whatever I put inside of here is a JavaScript expression, not a string anymore. So I can say username. And then just put my exclamation point right there and close my double quotes. The double quotes are unnecessary here. I'm doing them to print them out. So it looks like that on the page. So now if we go here and hard refresh again. Oh, I broke everything. There I'm getting my hello foo in double quotes. Same result we got with all the string concatenation, but hopefully you can see that this is a lot easier to kind of see what's actually going on, right? We just want the string double quoted hello username exclamation point, where you should insert the actual value of username here. Okay. So anytime you need to do complex string buildup, I recommend using template literals for that, like this. Use the backticks and just write your string out the way you want, and then put your variables in that $sign curly brace syntax. You can absolutely do string concatenation, and if you're just like slamming two strings together with the plus, then that's totally fine and simple too. It's just when you end up stringing together like 5 pluses with variables getting inserted everywhere, this is way cleaner. Interestingly enough, I could also add DOM elements here, right? So what if I wanted this whole hello username thing to get wrapped in a p tag inside that h1? That would be a kind of weird thing to do, but I'm just making up an arbitrary thing. I could do something like, let me get rid of these quotes and say, let's put this in a p tag. Cool, that's magic. I just wrote HTML in my string instead. Is that going to work right? Ooh, that wasn't what I wanted to do, was it? Why did it do that? Why didn't it just render me out a p tag inside my h1 when I said, hey, shove that in there?
String.
So here's where the key difference between inner text and inner HTML comes in. So if you set inner text, it will not parse it as HTML. So it will assume it's all just raw characters. So even if you write JavaScript inside of there or brackets or anything else, it's all just going to get printed as is. If you set inner HTML, it will assume what you've given it is a valid HTML string and try to read it like HTML. So now I can do the exact same thing. And when we refresh here again and say foo, now what we'll see here is inside my div, here's an h1, and inside of that, I know this is impossible to see. I'm trying to figure out how to zoom my screen, but there's a P tag. Hopefully you can see the highlighting happening there. So here's my H1, and then there's the P tag is inside of it. So it did actually build me a P tag, and it didn't print out brackets and P's all over my string here, okay? So if you are dynamically setting the HTML, creating HTML with a string literal, then you can do inner HTML. And so this is a powerful way, and you'll be doing this in your homework exercise to like just set some HTML without having to do a bunch of JavaScript DOM manipulation. You just want to actually build up an HTML string and shove the whole thing into the document as is. So you can just have a parent div or whatever, build up an HTML string and make that the inner HTML of that div. And then you've just injected a whole bunch of HTML via JavaScript without using document create element or element append node or any of those things. It's not that this is better or worse than those other ways. It's just that it depends on kind of where you're coming from and trying to get to, right? Sometimes it's going to be easier for you to just build up an HTML string and inject it. And sometimes it's going to be easier for you to work with one node at a time and create them with JavaScript properties and then attach them. And you'll just play with that stuff over the course of building these things out. Okay. Let's do a little more interactivity. We've got this fancy thing. Let's give ourselves a button that's going to randomly change some background color. So we're going to just, again, I'll do this in the DOM here. So let's give ourselves a button. And just simple button here. Okay. And since we've already looked at this, I'm just going to go ahead and give this an ID of color changer. And then it'll be easy for us to grab this button in our JavaScript. Okay. And now our fancy web page here has this magic, beautifully styled change background button sitting here. And when I click it, literally nothing happens, right? So now we're going to be dealing with this idea of events. Remember, we talked about events a little bit last class, and that a user clicking on something was an event. So this button, every time I do this, is emitting a click event. There's just nothing listening for that event to do anything with it, okay? So let's do that real quick. Oops, we'll get to that guy in a second. All right. So in our dialog here, let's grab that button. So const color button, that sounds like a good name. And I called that thing color changer. Right, what I called it. Yep. Okay. Cool. So what property of this button do we need to change to add an event listener to it? There's two ways we can do it. We can just set a property on the button itself is kind of the most straightforward. What would that property be? Anybody know?
On click.
On click, that's the one. So notice when I started typing on, you see all these things that VS Code is hinting for me on a board, on animation cancel, on aux click, on blur, on cancel, on etc. These are all JavaScript events. So input is an event, key down is an event, and then the properties for anything that should respond to those events will be on and the name of the event. Okay, so on click is in here somewhere. On click, magic. Okay. And this is going to equal something. And I'm going to want it to equal a function. So let's make that function called change color. And that doesn't exist right now. So it isn't going to do anything. And in fact, just to show you again, because we were looking at troubleshooting stuff the other day a little bit. If I refresh this page, you can see here, I'm already getting a reference error in my console. I know it's probably tiny to read. But it says change color is not defined because it tried to register that as a click, as an on click for this, and it doesn't know what it is. And if I click this, it's going to do nothing because that isn't registered. Okay. So, what I'm going to do down here is let's declare a function called change color. We did a bunch of this in your role-playing game already. I'm just going to have it change it to a random color, so it's not going to take any input arguments, because we're not asking the user to pick a color or anything, so we don't know where we would get one from. Okay, and then in here, we're going to do the thing. Right? Okay, So what does that thing look like? We could change the whole body color, probably is gonna be the most dramatic, so let's do that. So we need to get the body first, right? Let's go grab the body. Should only be one body tag in a document or it's not valid HTML, so that one I don't need to deal with an ID or anything on, we'll just grab the whole body. And then I can set body.style.background color. This is the same as adding a style attribute to the body tag with a background color CSS rule in it, okay? It's exactly what's going to happen when we do this. And I can set this to whatever would be a valid CSS rule for that. So let's just set it to red for now, so we can see that it does a thing. And see if we broke stuff. So highly recommend this process also as you're working on things when you're writing your own code, baby steps and test them. If you write too much code before you check anything and then something doesn't work, you end up in the spaghetti mess of trying to figure out where you actually went wrong. And it turned out it was that comma you dropped an hour ago, not any of the code you just wrote. So let's go take a look at what we just did and see if this works at all. Refresh the page. Here's my page. Uh-oh, not turning red. Why are we not turning red? Still says change color is not defined. That seems odd. Oh, that works. I just had to refresh my page. This isn't very fun because all it does is change it to red once, and now it's just changing it to red over and over again, which doesn't help us at all. Notice though, right here, God, I wish I could. Anybody know any good way for me to zoom the actual like DOM dev tools for anybody? Probably
Click.
some.
Now in the section you can do Command plus.
Hey, there we go. Thank you.
Yeah.
So you can see on this body tag right here, it actually added in the HTML DOM here, a style equals background color : red, right? So that's the HTML got updated because we updated the DOM by setting the style property on that body object, right? So let's make it just slightly more exciting. We'll pick 3 colors. So now I'm going to set an array. And red, green, blue seems perfectly reasonable to me. Those are all valid CSS colors. Now we're going to have to do some voodoo. I'm going to need to decide how I want to get one of these colors out of this array. So I could do a random one, or I could have it cycle through them. Since I'm only putting 3 in there, let's have it cycle through them. So now we're getting into arrays here sideways, Anya. I know that's later in today's in-class list, but we're getting there anyway. So let's maintain an index. That's going to change, so we're going to make it let, and I'm going to say it's going to be 0. Okay, so our first color here is going to we're going to grab colors at the index. So this is what's called bracket notation for indexing into an array. So right now this is the same as me saying colors 0. Okay, so all items in an array have an index, and it's just the slot in the container they're in. So if you just think about this as a container, it's the numbered slot they're in. Notice that 0 is the first slot though. Okay, this is the thing, if you've never experienced 0-based indexing in programming before, it will throw you off occasionally. There are only 3 hard things, and I just ruined the joke. There are 2 hard things in programming: naming things and cache invalidation and off by 1 errors. That's the punchline, right? So off by 1 errors will happen all the time when you're first getting used to this, which is you forget that the indexing starts at 0. So you try to go to the 4th thing in the array and it's the last one. And so you put in 4 as the index, but that index is really 3 and there is no 4 because there's only 3 things in here. So these are items 0, 1, and 2 respectively. Okay. So now I'm going to do this and say, instead of doing that, let's go ahead and get it from the index. Cool. Let's go back and refresh my page and see what I broke. Didn't break anything, it just turns red. Magic, but that's not doing anything useful for me, right? So now we could do something here, like say, let's let the index equal a, we will, I'm gonna cycle through this every time you click. So what we're actually gonna have to do is hold on to this index outside of the function. We'll get more into scopes in another class, but the problem here is every time I call this function, I'm resetting the index to 0 right now, right? So let's go ahead and move this out here, and to make it something more specific, I'm gonna say color index, so we know what it is, okay? And then we're gonna say every time we change color, we're gonna set the body background color to colors at color index. And then we're gonna increment the color index. So there's a few ways we can do this. We can say color index equals color index +1. And that's gonna mean every time we change the color, it's gonna move the index over. So the next time we change it, we'll get a new color. Right? That should work magically. There's bugs in here. If you haven't figured out what they are already, you're gonna see them in a second. So the first time I click this, I get red. Next time I click it, I get green. It's magic. I click it again, I get blue. What's gonna happen the next time I click it?
It's gonna increment beyond the array.
Yeah,
Uh-oh.
Yeah.
Nothing, because I'm trying to grab an index color. I'm actually surprised I didn't get a fatal error there. I'm trying to set the index to a color that is not existent in this array, right? Like I've gone off the end of the array. Sometimes that will cause your entire script to crash. Again, the browser's trying to be permissive, so it's like, I don't know, your handler broke, so I'm just not going to do anything. So we need to do a check here, right? So let's clean this up a little bit. So when we do, because what we want it to do is loop back around to red, right? If we run off the end. So first thing we could do is shorten this to this, right? Color index plus equals 1 is the same as color index equals color index +1. Since we're only incrementing by 1, we can do this in an even shorter way, color index ++. Right? We can also do ++ color index, and those will have the same net result, but they are slightly different depending on how you use them. So if you're using this on the fly, if you put the ++ first, you'll immediately get the value of it already incremented by 1. And if you put the ++ later, you'll get the value and then it will increment. Just something to be aware of. But I'm just gonna go ahead and index it. We're still gonna have the same problem though here, right? So what we actually need to do is say color index should get incremented unless we are at the end of the array, in which case we should set it back to 0. Okay. So what we're actually going to do here is say color index equals, and then actually I'm going to write this in more verbose if logic for you for a second, because I think it's be easier for you to see. So we're going to say if color index is greater than colors dot length. So now I'm getting the length property on the array. This is the only common property an array object has, is its length, and that's just the number of items that are in it. Okay. So if we are greater than colors index dot length -1, we'll come back to that in a second, then color index ++, else color index equals 0. Why did I have to do -1 here?
because it starts at 0.
Yep. So my last item, even though I have 3 items in the array, so the length of this array is 3, the index of the last item is 2. So I want to make sure I loop back to 0 if our color index is greater than or equal to. I'll make that greater than or equals to, because if it's already 2, I also want it to loop back around. Right. And now that I've done that, if we go
You're
back
set.
and refresh the page here. Red. Oh, let me refresh. I didn't finish the refresh. Got 2 servers going here. Okay. Red. Nothing. Something broke. Why did we break? Now we get into debugging. So there's 2 ways we could debug this, unless somebody already sees my immediate problem. So what we want to do here is say, what is our current color index? So one of the common ways to debug without using the debugger is just to put in some log statements. So let's say, setting color to index, and then we can put a variable in here, color index. So that's going to tell me what we think we're setting it to every time we click it. And also just for fun purposes for now, I'm going to comment out these two lines that do that prompting so we can just work on the color thing without getting prompted for our name every freaking time. Okay. Setting color to index 0, that's what we expect. It's green. Now it should be setting color to index 1, but it did not. And it did not again. Wise. I got this backwards, friends. See what I did here? Said only increment the color if we're already at the end. And I want to only increment the color if we're not already at the end. So this check should be less than or equals to. And actually, in this case, we're just going to want to index if we're not already at the end. So only if we're less than. Right? So I just had my comparison backwards. So that's why it wasn't doing anything, because we weren't at the end. So now, if we refresh this, we should see setting color to index 0, setting to index 1, setting to index 2, and now we should go back to 0. And now we can just loop through red, green, blue all day long. Isn't that exciting? We made a disco page. Okay. Now I could have written this entire function in this onClick property here instead of just setting it to the name of the function and declaring it down here, but that gets just like string concatenation, real messy, real fast if your function's longer than one little line. So if all I wanted this button to do was increment color index, then I could have just said onClick equals color index plus plus, and it would be okay, kind of thing. But generally speaking, this is the way you want to do it. Declare your event handler is what we would call this, because this is what handles the event. And then by setting that event handler equal to the onClick property on the color button, what we have done is functionally equivalent to this. This is the long form of that. Sorry for all the pop-ups that are now in your way. Jeez, man, it is all over trying to be helpful. Okay, these two lines are doing the same thing. Okay, so add event listener to the color button. On the event click, call the change color function. Is the same as saying color button on click, because on click is the shorthand for add event listener click. Okay, so two ways to do the same thing here. And there are times you can only do it this way. You're trying to add an event listener for some reason somewhere else that you can't set as a property on the element itself directly. So often we'll set event listeners on the document this way. So you do document.add event listener, because we just want the entire page to be listening for something to happen. Okay, and that's where that add event listener format comes in a lot. Any questions about any of that stuff?
Creating an error cannot access color index before initialization.
So you must be not declaring color index outside of your function change color.
I am.
Did you use is there any difference between your code and mine? Because there are some things, if we had done an arrow function or something, that would be different, and that's.
There may be some difference, but we can go through it later.
Yeah, so there is this concept just to be aware of what's called function hoisting, and variable hoisting. And so depending on how and where you declare things depends on what's in scope and what isn't. So that error means that your change color function, or however you wrote it, is trying to access color index in here before it's been declared. So make sure that color index is declared. If you wrote your change color in some other way that isn't doing the hoisting mine is, make sure this happens before you do that, and then it should be okay. I don't know if that's going to solve your problem without me seeing your code, but feel free to drop a snippet in the Slack or whatever, and we can look at it also. Speaking of which, while I'm on that real quick, I want to talk about snippets in Slack, because I have yet to see anybody use one. And they're really helpful for syntax highlighting. So y'all been doing good with your code blocks like Dancy just did. But let me grab Dancy's code and show you something that's gonna help here. And grab this. If you hit the little plus button here and do create a text snippet and then drop your code in there and then tell it what it is, this is JavaScript, you get syntax highlighting. Magic sauce. Also, these are collapsible, so you can hide it and not have to look at the code block. So when you're doing anything more than a few lines of code, highly recommend the text snippets, okay? So what do you got going on here? Yeah, color index.
Calling the function. He signs it.
Oh, yeah, you're on click here, get rid of the parentheses. So what's happening here is, let me zoom in on this. This is a common mistake. You're actually saying, what we want to be doing here is saying the on click handler is the function change color. But what you're doing by adding the parentheses is you're saying the on click handler is the result of calling change color. So it tried to call change color right here, which meant it tried to already change the color. If you look at my code for that, notice I'm just passing it the name of the function and not putting parens after it to call it.
Okay.
So that's all. I would get the same error. So the error he was saying, if I do this here, you can see already in the background, actually, if you didn't catch it. On first page load, my color's already turning red and I'm already getting that console log. Because the color is getting, that function is getting called immediately. And we don't want to call it when we load the page because, and that only worked because I defined it first. If I did this, I'm going to get that same error. Now, when I do this, I'm getting can't access color index before we initialize it. So two different ways for that bug to manifest. If I declare color index first and then call it here, it will change once right on page load. But neither of those is what we want. What we want to do is just say only call that when you actually click it. So just pass the entire function definition to on click. Make sense?
Thank you.
Yeah, you bet. Really good question.
Another question, you did a equal to, and it kind of put a line in between the sideways character, what do you call that? Is that just the VS Code function?
I'm sorry. You're gonna do it one more time. I just had to turn you up a little bit. You're just a little behind the mic for me.
Yeah, you did the greater than equal to. And it kind of like made that symbol together. Is that just
Oh.
the VS?
That's what's called a font ligature. And so any editor that supports font ligatures will do that for you if you set them. There's nothing fancy about that character. It is the two characters greater than and equals next to each other. It just displays it that way. It does the same thing because I'm using a font that supports ligatures. Nerd Fonts is a repo that is the most common one for those. If you just look up font ligatures in VS Code, you can look at how to set those up. But it's the same thing I get when I do so. Instead of equals showing up as two separate equals, it draws them as one long equals. Or if I do 3, it gives me the triple bar. Same thing if I do like a not equals, which is just exclamation point equals, it'll change it to that symbol for me. Or not equals equals is not strict equality. The actual text being stored in the file is still those 3 separate characters, exclamation point, equal sign, equal sign. It's just a font display thing. Good question. Okay. All right. So we just talked about arrays and their indexing and bracket notation. We can index into a string the same way with that bracket notation, by the way. So if you have a string, I'll just do this in the browser console real quick to show you. If I do foo bar at index 5, I get the character R. Okay, so a string can be treated kind of like an array. It is not an array. We'll get more into that in another class, but all we're saying there with that bracket notation and a number is go to, and those are 0 based also, give me the 5th, the index 5 in this string, which will be the 6th character from the beginning of the string. Okay, so you can access strings the same way. We're going to run out of time to do it in class today, but in the in-class example here, one of the things I was going to suggest is you could go ahead and play with what we just built for that greeting and actually make a little user avatar instead. So have it take when the user inputs their first and last name, grab only the first character of their first name and do like first initial dot last name. So like, you know, to do that on a base level here, instead of just setting, let me uncomment my prompt. Instead of just doing username here, what we would need to do is something like username 0, and then a period. And then we would also get username. And then we have to figure out how we go get everything after the space, right? I'm gonna give you a clue to that one on an array method here in a second. Okay, if I do this now, it's just gonna give me just the first initial. That's all we'll get. Okay, so I'll let you all kind of like play with that one as your like trivia quiz to get, because I need to make sure we talk about these array methods real quick so that you have them in as a tool in your kit to play with. So I mentioned that an array is just a container, right? So think about like a box we can put stuff in and take stuff out of, and we can look for stuff that's at certain indexes, right? Certain numbered slots in that container. Okay, so we've covered the zero-based bracket notation. There is a newer method on arrays called @ that we can call that works the same as bracket notation, except with a cool added feature. You can use negative indexes and it will count from the end backwards. So if you do @-1, it will give you the last thing, which is pretty neat. You didn't used to be able to do that in JavaScript, and Python and other languages support that. So you used to have to always do, if you wanted the last thing in a, I'm going to actually, instead of doing this here, I'm going to open a node REPL real quick because I think it's going to be easier to show this to you. So let me just make an array here. We're going to play with some methods. So I'll do const array equals, and let's put some things in here. Foo, bar, as, and we'll put some numbers in here too. I can mix types up in an array all I want. So I got numbers and strings in here. All right, so now if I read out my array, there's my array. It's an array with 3 strings and 3 numbers in it. So I can look at array.length. That's a property. It is 6, right? Got 6 things in there. And again, if I wanted that last thing in there, whatever it is, which currently happens to be the number 3, I used to have to do it this way. That gets me 3, right? Give me the thing at the index of the length -1, which will be the last numbered slot. But now I can also just do array.at -1, and I'll get the same thing. So at's pretty cool. It works the same way going forward. So array at 0 is my first thing. That's foo. Array.at 0 will be the same thing. Okay. So just 2 ways to index into the array and get a thing back. Let's say I want to take the last thing out of the array and give it back to myself. I'm going to make a variable for it called last thing. Don't have to store it in a variable, but I'm just gonna. Array.pop. This is going, pop is a method that will remove the last item from the array and hand it back to you. So now last thing is the number 3. And my array now only has 5 things in it. Right? So array.length is now 5. See how that works? That's pop. Any questions on pop? It's one of the most common array methods you'll ever use. Especially if you're using arrays like a list or a stack of stuff and you want to just like take the latest thing off the stack and do something with it and not have it still be in the stack, that's pop. Okay. If I wanted to just read the value of the array without taking it out, that's where I'd use @ or a bracket index to just go get the value, right? But pop will take it out. Well, I want to put it back. So for that, I'm going to use push and pass it the number 3. Now notice that array.push returned the number 6. Push does not return the thing you just put in the array or the whole array. It just returns the new length of the array. So now if I look at array again, 3 is back there. Oh, my thing doesn't want to scroll now because I zoomed in weird. Okay. Now 3 is back at the end of my array because I pushed it in. So I could do another one, push thing. Let's push a string in there. Now my array is 7 long, and now that's my array. Okay. So push shoves something onto the end, pop takes something off the end. So push and pop are kind of interchangeable pairs. Shift and unshift are the same idea, but at the front side of the array. Okay. So if I do array.shift, I'm going to get back foo. And now if I look at array, my foo's gone. It pulled the thing out of the front of the array. If I want to put it back, I can do array.unshift. And now it pushes it back in at the front side. Shift is pretty common to use to grab the first thing in the array. Unshift is something you want to be careful about using unless you really need it, because generally speaking, push and pop are faster operations. So working with the end of the array. And the reason for that is like we built our container and given our, hey, said, hey, computer, grab some memory and give me a container that holds 7 items. If I pop off the last thing or push a thing into the end, I only have to update the end of that chunk of memory, right? But if I push a new thing in the beginning or pull something out of the beginning, it has to move everything in memory over. So it has to rewrite the whole array in memory again, which is slower. So generally we tend to use push and pop whenever possible over shift and unshift because it's cheaper on computer resources to manipulate the end of the array than it is to rewrite the whole array every time. Okay.
Because if you have too many of those, then your code will be non-performant.
Yeah, exactly. It is slower to do an unshift than it is to do a push or a pop. Exactly. Because you have to reallocate all the memory for the array over again. Okay, so we've covered push, pop, shift, and unshift. Okay, we're gonna do a couple other ones here real quick. So join. This one's gonna be fun with what I have in there currently. Let's do const joined equals array.join. Okay. Oh, look at that. It's a string with all of the items comma separated. Okay. I could do weird joined. Oop. And if I could type, that would be better. And now I get that string instead. So if you pass an argument to join, it will insert that argument in between every item of the array and give you back a string with it all shoved together with that in between. If you don't pass anything, the default separator is a comma. So you'll just get back a comma separated list. Okay. The reverse of this is a string method called split. So if I take new array equals weird joined dot split. I got an array with just that string in it, which is not what I wanted. I wanted to split it back apart at the weird. So let's do split array equals weird joined dot split. And just like join, I can pass it, split it everywhere you find a weird. And now I get back to the original array I joined together with weirds before. Okay, so you can split a string into an array and you can pass it the separator you want, and you can join an array into a string and pass it the thing you want to join it all together with. If you want to join it without any separator, you can pass an empty string as the separator. So if I do const, I don't know, smooshed array, and I pass it just empty quotes. That is 2 single quotes, by the way. You could pass it 2 double quotes also. I'll just do that for clarity and we're not confused. You pass it an empty character, then you get the string with no commas in between it or anything. Okay, if you pass it with no arguments when you do join, you'll get commas in between each item. If you pass an empty string, you'll get it literally smashed together. So this can also be a useful way to build up a complicated string, is to build up an array of all the parts of the string and then join it together.
Now that you've done it without anything in between, you can't split that, can you?
I mean, I can, but I'm going to get some weird things, right? So if I do like, that's just going to give me an array with a single string. If I do the same thing,
Yeah, that's a whole string.
sorry, smooshed array dot split, and I pass it an empty character, it's going to split it at every character. So now I get that array.
Okay.
That makes sense.
If you got detailed, you could split it by position, right?
Not directly with the split command. So with the split method, you're going to pass it a separator. It's going to match on. So you can pass it an empty separator, which will split on every character, or you can pass it something to look for to split on. But if that string doesn't have a splitting character in it, then to split by index, you're going to need to do some type of for loop or another iterator where you say, walk through and take 3 characters and then make that a new string, push that into a new array. So for instance, we're not going to have time for me to demo this right now. But what you do is create an empty array and then use this push method we already looked at. So you do a loop through the string. And if you wanted to split it every 3 characters, every time your index is an even multiple of 3, grab those characters and push them into the array you just created. And then you'll end up with an array of it chunked by 3s. There's other helper methods and shortcuts for doing that kind of thing also, but split by itself will not let you split by a numerical index. I think there's a chunk helper now that does that though. Okay, and if not, there's a Lodash library, which is a bunch of JavaScript helpers that's fairly common, and I know it has chunks, and you can say split this array up into chunks of size 5 or size 3 or whatever, which just does that same looping through it I just described. It just is already written for you in a helper function. So cool. Slice and splice. These allow us to take a portion of an array or mutate the original array. So we're going to do these real quick. So if I just said csv.slice 3, that's going to give me everything starting at the 3rd item in. So 0, 1, 2, index 3, which was this empty character, the space, right? Not an empty character, a space. From there to the end. So now I got a new array back. This is a new array. It didn't mutate the original. CSV is still in its entirety. But it gave me a new array back starting at index 3 of CSV and going to the end. If I don't want to go all the way to the end, I can do CSV slice 3, 6, and that will give me the items at index 3, 4, and 5. So up to, but not including the endpoint you give it. So that's a good way if you want to take a portion of an array and get a copy of it. Slice is your friend. Splice works in a very similar way, but it mutates the original array. So this is not going to give me a new array back. This is now going to muck up CSV. So when I talked about mutability, we're going to mutate this array right now, which often is a source of bugs if you're not careful. So the first argument is the index I want to splice at. So I'm going to say, like, let's splice at index 2, and then how many I want to take. And I'm going to take 8, we'll just say as random. That's what I just took out. So it returned back to me the items from item 2 up to 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, but not including, right? So I got up to the C here and it returned all those to me. So kind of like slice, very similar, except let's look at what happened to CSV now. It's missing all that stuff in the middle. I actually literally spliced it out of the array. Okay. And if I do that again and I pass it a 3rd argument, it inserted that 3rd argument in the hole where it took those other 6 things out. Okay, so slice says, give me a copy of a slice of this array from this point to this point. Splice says, slight chunk part of this array, take it out and optionally put something else back in. So it's mutating the original array. Slice is handing you back something new. Includes is the last really common one I'm going to talk about today. So that's just a matter of csv.includes foo. True. There's a foo in that array. csv.includes bar. False. There is not a bar in that array. Okay. So that's the includes. And then there's sort. This one's a whole can of worms. So we're not really going to get into it today, but it does mutate the original array. So if I call csv.sort, now that array is in a totally different order. It didn't give me back a new one. It sorted the original. And it sorts them by default in what's called lexicographic order. So it's very close to alphabetical order, but not quite. Generally, it will land in what looks like alphabetical order to you. You can pass a function to sort to tell it exactly how you want something sorted when it's not a simple just sort numbers or letters in order. We're not going to get into that today. But that lands in this whole chunk here you all can look at on your own if you like, if you're poking into arrays that are what are called iterative methods. So all of these take a function, walk through all the things in the array and call that function on them. So map, filter, sort, find index, which will give you back the index of where that thing was in the array. Find will actually find the first thing that matches your function in the array, etc. So we're not gonna have time to get into these today. We'll look at them again later, and you'll definitely get into them in advanced JavaScript module 3. But know that those exist. So these guys, push, pop, shift, all that, just operate directly on an existing array. And with the exception of slice, splice, and join, do not take arguments really. Or if they do, they take primitive arguments, like the thing you're looking for, or the separator character. So they're just gonna take a string or a number. The iterative methods will all take a function. So you're gonna say, hey, do this thing to everything in this array. Right? So we can dig into those in another class, all right? We are at time. So I just wanna sum up we didn't do these things. These are 2 exercises you can sort of play with here. You can play with the idea of having a button that lets you do 99 bottles of beer on the wall in your DOM, right? Just update the sentence and the div over and over again every time you click, and you can count down. If you want to be fancy, make it do the whole poem. So take a number you want it to start at. You can have it click a button to take one down, have another button to click to pass one around, and then have it return the final count. That's a pretty simple example to play with both DOM manipulation and array methods. So I'd recommend that. The other option is sort of just making a simple shopping cart. So make an array that tracks an array of objects, kind of like your locations thing in the Dragon Slayer, right? And just see if you can add an item or remove an item from it and get that to work. That's another good way to review arrays and some basic DOM interaction. Those are optional as you have time for and or want to cement this class stuff. And then the mandatory homework that I'm not checking, so whatever. The homework assignment is the next exercise after the dragon slaying in this exercise here. Form validation with building a calorie counter. So this one's going to deal with some template literals and strings. It's going to introduce the concept of regular expressions to you at a very basic level. We didn't touch those at all in class today, but they're just fancy patterns for matching strings, and they're dark magic, and you should learn to love them. We'll go into them in more depth in the next class, so don't feel bad at all if you're confused about the regular expression stuff. One site I am going to drop in the channel here at the moment is this guy here. It is your friend. So if you're curious about the regular expressions when you start playing with them in that exercise and you are confused about what's going on, that regex101.com site is fantastic. You can put in the pattern in the upper section here, and then you can put in the string you're testing it against down here, and it will show you what's matching or not and why, and give you errors and all kinds of fabulous feedback about what your regular expression is actually doing. You shouldn't need that to do the step-by-step in the free code camp stuff, but if you're trying to understand it better, this is by far the most useful tool for just playing around with regular expressions without having to write any other code. Okay. That is where we're headed for next week. We are at time. I won't keep anybody long. I am happy to hang out here for another, 10 to 20 minutes or whatever and answer questions, but I'm officially done with official content. So.
He's taking it with you. Thanks, Eric. Got a bunch here.
Thanks, everybody. That was awesome. Was there a question in any of that exiting? All I heard was some thanks and some exits. I just want to make sure I didn't miss anybody.
I don't think any questions on this end.
Okay, cool.
Good.
I'm going to be on Slack all afternoon, hacking around with people on Hackathon stuff today too, that are working on our Tulsa Web Devs site project. So feel free, and in general, I don't mind DMs or whatever. Also, if there's a question you're not comfortable asking in the cohort channel, I prefer you ask them in the cohort channel because your cohort mates will benefit from your questions also. But feel free to ping me about stuff. I'll be hacking around on stuff all day today, so and probably tomorrow. So I'm here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You bet.
All right, everyone, have a good weekend.
Yeah.
Thanks, Eric. See ya.
See ya. Bye, everybody.